Good day, everyone. Welcome back to our YouTube channel. For today's discussion, we will be talking about Unit 4, Learning Resources and Instructional Input Accommodation. But before we proceed, let us first meet the Group 7. First, I am Zandra Kim Partosa. Another member is Shervin Palamos. And then Christine Tulbo, and lastly, Jean Palalon. We are all second-year students pursuing Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in English at Negros Oriental State University, Shaton Campus. So for our objectives, we have first, we will be able to identify the state of special education inclusion programs in the Philippines. Second, we will be able to recognize the concept of special education and inclusion programs. And third, we will be able to learn about the importance of special education and inclusion programs in the Philippines. So, let's proceed to the discussion. So what is special education? Special education refers to a range of services that can be provided in different ways and in different settings. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to special education because it tailored to meet the needs of students with disabilities. Special education focuses on helping kids with disabilities to learn, but it doesn't mean placing kids in a special classroom all day long. In fact, federal law says that kids who get special education services should learn in the same classroom as other kids as much as possible. This is known as Least Restrictive Environment, or LRE. So what is a special education programs? Special education programs are intended for students who are cognitively, physically, socially, and or emotionally delayed. So this type of delay, also known as a developmental delay, refers to an aspect of the child's overall development. When we say development, it incorporates physical, cognitive, and scholastic skills. So that puts them behind their peers. And students' needs cannot be met in the traditional classroom setting due to special requirements or due to the developmental delay. So special education programs and services modify content, teaching methodology, and delivery of instruction to meet the specific needs of the students. These services are provided at no cost to the family and are available to children until the age of 21. Special education programs are designed to meet the specific and unique instructional needs of each child, allowing students to be grouped homogeneously by developmental stage or ability rather than by age. This unique aspect of special education allows educators to provide aid and instruction based on a child's interest and ability rather than biological age. Now let us proceed to the historical background of special education. So, as you can see in the slide, there are these three persons, and these three persons have great impact on special education during the early society. So, although there are isolated examples of caring for and treating disabled individuals in ancient Greece and Rome, early societies typically shunned people who differed from the norm. During the Middle Ages, the churches became the first institution to provide care for physically or mentally impaired people. But the development of techniques associated with special education did not merge until the Renaissance, with its emphasis on human dignity. So in the mid-1500s, Pedro Ponce de Leon succeeded in teaching deaf pupils in Spain to speak, read, and write. It is assumed that his methods were followed by Juan Pablo Bonet, who in 1620 published the first book on the subject. And this gave the rise to a wider European interest in the education of deaf individuals. and no serious attempt was made to educate or to train persons with visual impairments, however, until the late 18th century. Scientific attempts to educate children with intellectual disabilities originated in the efforts of Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard or Itard, a French physician and otologist. In his classic book, The Wild Boy of Oberon, in 1807, he related his 5-year effort to train and educate a boy who had been found running wild in the woods of Aveyron. Itard's work with the boy became notable for the possibilities it raised regarding the education of persons with mental or emotional disabilities. Special education during the 20th century. Special education for people with disabilities became universal in developed countries by the late 20th century. Concurrent with this development was the identification of two concepts of individual differences, which is, first, inter-individual differences, which compares one child with one another, and second, intra-individual differences, which compares the child's abilities in one area with the child's abilities in one or in other areas. And the grouping of children in special classes rests on the concept of in their individual differences, but the instructional procedures for each child are determined by the intra-individual differences, that is, by a child's abilities and disabilities. Now let us proceed to the philosophy of special education. The general philosophy of special education is that all people have the ability to learn, regardless of their particular disabilities. And the trend in public education has shifted from isolating special education students in separate classrooms to mainstreaming them in the regular classroom for at least part of the day. So what is most likely the objectives of special education? So the special education staff, in conjunction with classroom teachers and other educational personnel, have a commitment to the following objectives, which is first, to create an effective climate for learning by sharing all available information about a child's disability pertinent to the child's performance in educational setting, and to provide and implement program and testing accommodation as stipulated on the IEP, and to facilitate each student's academic progress and social development by establishing appropriate goals and providing instructions, and to support and act a resource for classroom teachers working with students with special needs, and lastly, to encourage students to be aware of their strengths and weaknesses so that they can become good advocates for themselves in all settings. The next slide is talking about John Dewey. The democratic faith in human equality is belief that every human being, independent of the quantity or range of his personal endowment, has the right to equal opportunity with every other person for development whatsoever gift he has. Dewey, 1939 to 1981, page 227 to 228. Although Dewey never wrote specifically about disability, his philosophy is sympathetic to special education programs and supplies theoretical and practical support for inclusive democratic schooling that actively values all students of all backgrounds and abilities. To talk about the United States Education for All Handicapped Children Act 1975. In 1975, Congress enacted Public Law 94 to 142, more commonly known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, or EHA. The goal of EHA was to ensure children with disabilities gained access to a free and appropriate public education. This law provided local and statewide support and protection to children and youth with disabilities as well as their families. Under EHA or EHA, all public schools were granted federal funding that provided equal access to education for children with physical and/or mental disabilities. Schools were required to evaluate children and create an educational plan that paralleled the academic experience of their non-disabled peers. EHA requirements also provided parents and families the necessary support systems to ensure that their child received appropriate and adequate services, along with the services needed to the dispute decision made on behalf of the child. So as you can see, the next slide is about related video and the video link was provided. So this video contains an additional information about special education and you can also watch this video later. While in the Philippines, the growth of special education in the Philippines has been a relatively good support all these years, both by the government, non-government organization, and stakeholders in response to the needs and challenges of the times. The level of awareness of both the government and the private sector in providing equal opportunities to children with special needs have considerably increased. One positive development in special education is the implementation of Republic Act 7277, otherwise known as the Magna Carta for Disabled Persons, an act providing for the rehabilitation, self-development, and self-reliance of disabled persons and their integration into the mainstream of society. In support of this legislation, the Department of Education has directed all school divisions in the country to establish special education centers to help provide effective delivery of special education services nationwide. Although special education in the country started 94 years ago, in many respects or aspects, the demand and needs of this program have not changed. The advent of the 21st century requires new perspectives and direction in special education to meet the needs of disadvantaged children against the persistent challenges and the demands of the new millennium. Now let us talk about the program modifications, accommodations, supplementary aids and services. Supplementary aids and services and/or program modification or supports means aids, services, and other supports that are provided in general education, classes, or other education-related settings to enable students with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled students to the maximum extent appropriate in the least restrictive environment. The IEP must specify the projected date for initiation of services and the frequency, location, and duration of such services. Following are examples of supplementary aids and services, accommodation, and program modification. So first is a note taker. And then second is instructional materials in alternative forms. For example, the one or the three things that you can see in the slide, which is the braille, the large print, and the books on tape. Another bullet is the extra time to go between classes, and then special seating arrangements, highlighted works, study guide outlines of key concept, use of a study carrel for independent work, and again, books on tape, and then assignment for supplementary school personnel, which for example is a teacher aide or a teaching assistant, behavior management or support plan, and lastly, extra time to complete our assignments. Now we are going to talk about inclusion program. So what is inclusion program? If special education is the practice of providing individualized instruction and support to students with disabilities or learning difficulties, inclusive education, on the other hand, is the practice of educating students with disabilities alongside their peers without disabilities in the same classroom. Meaning, it is meant for all learners. So inclusive education is based on the premise that all students develop and learn differently, and therefore one fixed of teaching and learning cannot ensure successful outcomes for all. Inclusive education is not just limited to including students with disabilities, but it is responsible for ensuring that their needs are met in the mainstream classroom as well. Implementing inclusive education requires flexible curricula that have been designed keeping in mind diverse learners. This is to ensure that multiple pathways are provided to students to reach the same goal as opposed to the traditional one-size-fits-all methodology. So there is evidence, and it is found on alana.org, something which is a PDF. It suggests that inclusive education benefits not just only learners with disabilities, but those without disabilities as well. And it helps build the capacity of teachers and school system. So an inclusive school will ideally have both practices feeding into each other. Special education services will ensure that students with disabilities are able to keep the skills required to access the general curriculum and receive appropriate support, along with accommodations and modifications, which can be read in understood.org, which is an article entitled The Differences Between Accommodation and Modification. It says there that it is needed to be successful. So inclusive education or inclusive classroom practices will help students feel more included and at par with their peers, thus reducing the extent to which the special educator may be responsible for their learning. So, while the onus of special education lies primarily with special educators, the onus of inclusive education lies with all teachers as well as the entire school community. Consistent collaboration among special education and general education or mainstream teachers helps understand and meet the diverse needs of our students and builds the capacity of all educators, thus creating a stronger education system. So you might have questioned what are the roles of the teacher in special education. So special education teacher serves as advocates for students with disabilities and special needs. This includes ensuring that all school officials and employees understand the importance of inclusion and how to best implement inclusion in all campus activities. Special education teachers in school with inclusion policies spend most of their time forming relationship with specific students, accompanying them to classes, and ensuring they are receiving adequate support and opportunity. Another role of special education teacher in inclusive classroom is to conduct regular assessments to determine whether students are achieving academic goals. Lessons also must be periodically evaluated to determine whether they are sufficiently challenging without overwhelming the students. Students should gain a feeling of self-confidence and independence in general education settings, but they should also feel sufficiently supported. So special education teachers also organize periodic IEP meetings with each student, their family, and certain staff members to determine whether adjustments need to be made to the student's plan. Special education teachers often sit with or near with students with IEPs to monitor their progress and provide any special instruction or supplemental learning materials. Students require varying levels of individual instruction and assistance, which is based on their unique needs. Teachers might also pull students out of the class for one-on-one lessons or sensory activities, or arrange for time counselors, speech therapies, dyslexia coaches, and other specialized personnel. So special education instructors may need to make sure that paraprofessionals or therapists are present in the classroom at certain times to assist the students. This is also to help maintain a positive climate. They also might assist the general education teacher in presenting lessons to the entire class, grading papers, enforcing rules, and other classroom routines. So that's it for our discussion for special education. I hope you've learned something from our discussion, and the rest of the topics covered by Unit 4 will be discussed by my group mates.